take your seats. Let's begin. We are a little bit late, so let's start immediately. I am chair of this panel, which will discuss varieties of institutionalism. And we have three panelists: Charles Kirschbaum. Is that the way to pronounce? Probably not. Yes? Basile Aguirre and Bernardo Miller. We'll start with Charles, okay? And I am the chair and the discussant.
So monopolization.
This is a monopolization of rules. I'm sorry, Commissioner. So what the rules are, you have 20 minutes to speak. I'll have 10 minutes to discuss. And then we open to the audience for questions.
Okay. But please stay. I'm trying to convince that even incomplete and not up to date is important. I was commissioned to present sociological institutionalism, and I thought of bringing up this stream of research to update to today's, but it's huge, and probably most of the most interesting things were created in the 90s or the 80s anyway. So that's my take. So if I have to summarize the whole thing, I would have this scene in You've Got Mail that Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan had this incredible dialogue about Starbucks. So life is about, for many people, to go to Starbucks and have few choices, and still they think they are free to choose whatever they want. And how Starbucks could shape this idea for them. So this kind of summarizes my idea on how to present sociological institutionalism for you today. So I'm bringing now some very central cases for sociological institutionalism that inspired a whole generation of researchers. So the first one, you have a scholar who goes to Africa, invited by UN. He goes to schools, and everybody says that schools are great in a few towns in Africa, and he goes there, it sucks. Has nothing to do with what was on the paper. And he cannot understand that. Second, a Harvard graduate student goes to museums in Boston, and he's expecting to see different pictures, and he always sees the same Van Gogh, Matisse, the same painters all the time. And then finally, two researchers try to understand why some companies adopt new practice and they seem to be efficient for some, and then afterwards some companies adopt the same practice and it's clearly not efficient for them. So these three cases in a certain way became classic for sociological institutionalism. And why is that? So the first example, the first anecdote is actually John Mayer going to Africa. And they are saying, okay, whatever you think that is rational, it's a myth. Myth, that's a lie, but it's a myth that it's only something that I have as a symbolic thing in my head. And because of that, it's possible, if it's symbolic, it's possible to have a practice one way and portray something else to an audience. And what is important here is that I have an audience that will trust and believe that, because we are sending the right signals for the audience to believe that. Okay, and I can explore further afterwards, but he says also that this decoupling between practice and what is accounted is not only possible, but also needed for the system to continue. The second one is DiMaggio Paolo, specifically the graduate student was DiMaggio in Boston. And he is saying, okay, we don't have, actors face tremendous cognitive costs to understand, to create new institutions and new possibilities. And because of that, they tend to see what's available. Given a huge uncertainty of that, they will try to adopt what is available in terms of practices. So they will probably be geared to adopt legitimate and acceptable practice, and this is probably being drawn out of a constrained menu of options. So that's why I brought the Starbucks idea for you today. And a very common expression that we have from this school is mimetic isomorphism, that economic actors will copy each other because they don't have the exact means and link. They prefer many times just to copy other people. This school is not saying that this is the only explanation for adopting new practices. It's only saying that on top of traditional economic explanations, we have to consider these seriously. And then finally, the final example that I'm bringing today is Tobert and Zucker. They are showing that early adopters tend to be a little bit more rational and deliberate, and late adopters will be more geared towards what is legitimate and appropriate. And because of that, we might have a kind of dimension here on routine thinking, taken for granted thinking, and more deliberate poll, and say, okay, economic actors might fall somewhere in between depending on their situation in an industry. So from these cases, I want to build, upon these cases, I want to build some of the insights of this school. So one of them is trying to understand what is institution, and here's a little more recent text. It's, I love this quote on the bottom. Shared rules and typifications that identify categories of social actors and their appropriate activities or relationships. So given some categories and how I identify myself in this social context, I will follow some appropriate rules that is bringing with this category. Now, the Margin Powell 91, and this is one of the best summaries of the whole theory, they try to establish a comparison. Of course, this comparison doesn't take into account all, for the last 20 years, all rational choice additions. So this is probably very passé in terms of good account of rational choice. But it's interesting how some of these seem to be still current. So for instance, in rational choice, you'll see institutions and human design, while in sociology, institutions come about as a product of action. And if means are there to achieve ends, institutions might ask, where do preferences come from? And this is something that is usually a question more in the sociological field. And if institutions are answered for opportunism, imperfect, asymmetric information, costly monitoring, and here we have the sound of Oliver Williamson, sociological institutionalism will say, okay, we have a constrained menu of options, and we have also to take in account cultural and historical context in a much bolder way than institutional economics. And if conventions are thought of convenient choices, and we have this idea of arbitrariness of conventions in many of institutions, sociological institutionalism will say, okay, there's a blurred line here. Many of the conventions take a status of rule-like because they end up being taken as given. And how to explain stability? That's a hard question for rational choice. Rational choice we try to probably to explain as vested interests, for instance. And while sociological institutionalism will say we have huge sunk costs, but mostly of those sunk costs are cognitive. You just don't have too much way of imagining new institutions here. Okay, so I'm trying to wrap up this presentation with some self-criticism of this school. And this self-criticism happened in the late 80s and early 90s and opened up the whole research for the last 10, 20 years. So that will open a little bit our opportunities for discussion later on. So first, what is the role of agency anyway? So it's interesting because in the origin of this school, there was a lot of room for human creativity and agency as well. It was not only about copying other people. It was much more than this. And for some reason, most of the research in the late 80s, early 90s was about puppets copying each other, and that was it. So we still have to explain how innovation come about. Then, so for the same phenomena, for instance, copying, rational choice might give some alternative explanations. So for instance, many situations might be rational to copy. And it's not only about taking for grantedness of an institution or just because it's routine thinking, it's something else. And this was a criticism by Abel in 98, and probably in the last 10, 20, 12 years, very little was done to cross-check the same phenomena with different hypotheses. And then, of course, normative implications. If I'm producing public policy and, for instance, in art, in culture, and I think museums will copy each other if I give funding, and because of funding, people try to copy each other because they see who is getting funding and who is not. How can I build public policies that will permit innovation here? And if you look at a level of a company, of a firm, if companies copy each other, how can I explain innovation and economic profits? So that's a little bit of a problem for this school as well to answer. Okay, so and finally, I'm just trying to bring about some of the ideas here. One thing that is also a huge criticism here in this school is that is the symbolic dimension. And I gave the example of art, I gave the example of education, and several of the examples that were chosen by this school were examples that were very heavy in the symbolic dimension. And people would say, okay, education is very strong in the symbolic dimension. Art, even more. How can you establish efficient measure in arts? So is it possible to apply this thinking to profit-making companies and other parts of the economy? So this has been a huge criticism. And of course, if I have this problem here, that I cannot apply that well this school to profit-making companies, how can I explain also heterogeneity of profits among firms? Okay, so I'm trying to stop here. I can talk much more about this subject, but I just wanted to give you a hint of what this school is all about. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very glad to be here and to be able to discuss this so interesting subjects with all of you. When Sylvia invited me to participate on this table, and then after when Charles talked to me, I thought, well, what am I going to tell an audience of almost economists, as Charles put in his title? And because majority of you knows the various approaches, or at least some of the approaches that deals with institutions. And then the idea that came into my mind was to try to gather the ideas of some scholars that works with institutions and try to see if is there any signal of convergence on their works. Okay, so The objective of this speech is to highlight elements of convergence between different institutional economic approaches. And the motivation, the main motivation for this objective is because what we observe is that we have many parallel lines of theories, which, as Charles has already showed, have their specific use. And it will be nice, of course I'm not thinking about a new classical model again, but it will be nice if we could combine in certain ways, because in many problems we face, as for instance, a problem of collective action, okay? We have, as I guess Charles also pointed already, we have behaviors that are much more based on habits, as well as we have behavior that is actually driven by intention. So I think it's extremely important if we could, as a profession, develop a theory like that. After I thought about talking about this, I saw in the program that Professor Hodgson is going to talk about trying to combine not only the various approaches on institutional economics, if I can say that, if that exists, but also the various approaches in institutions. And so probably my speech here will be a kind of very superficial introduction to what we are going to hear later on in the afternoon. But anyway, that's what I did. I began exactly with this quotation, Douglas North, that say that the human environment, okay, is a construct of rules that define the framework of human interaction. And then he points that we scientists, the sociologists, the political scientists, the economists, lawyers, business administration, divided the environment in many disciplines. And the analytical framework that we should target is to integrate the insights derived from these artificially separate disciplines if we are to understand the process of change. So I think that the great contribution of the various approaches of these disciplines actually have as a main target the understanding of change, understanding of institutional change. And this is why I quote this part of the 2005 book from North, because this highlighted why it's so important to try to combine these theories. From this, I have to ask, because it always comes into my mind, okay? What is institutional economics? You actually can ask another question. Is there an institutional economics? Because there are so many approaches that we actually cannot say. It's not possible to say, because some people call themselves new institutional economists. Others call themselves institutional sociologists. Others call themselves evolutionary economists, institutionalists, and so on. So actually, as a discipline, it doesn't exist. But all those people have something in common. What do they have in common that is unquestionable? They all attribute a huge importance to institutions, okay? And they all have the purpose to explain institutional change in a way or another, okay? So we can enter to discuss some alternative views about those approaches. And I began with DiMaggio and Powell, who have probably the most pessimistic attitude towards any kind of unification that the disciplines and approaches could follow. In their opinion, okay, all those approaches and disciplines, organization theory, political science, public choice, etc., they share a common skepticism about the place of social process atomistic conception, or said in other words, they don't believe in holistic explanation. They are all individual methodological scientists. And they also share the conviction of the importance of the institution's mechanisms. But it is all. This is all that, according to the Major and Power, they have in common. But other scientists, other scholars, disagree, and they saw much more convergence and much more similarities among those authors than Power and DiMaggio see. Okay? And I'm going to give you some examples. I choose, of course, some examples because of the scarcity of time. And probably because of my bounded rationality, I should have chosen wrong. But anyway, that was my choice. And the first one that I'd like to discuss with you is Williamson. Williamson presents in this Taking Stock article of him of 2000 this scheme, okay, where he compares actually in a complementary way all, I could say, all the approaches that were in fashion at the time. And he said that in the first level, the first level, it's not okay, the first level, we find what he calls social theory. And this level is characterized by embeddedness, informal institutions, customs, traditions. I think we could also classify evolutionary theory in this first level, which is the level that takes a long time to change. It changes very incrementally and takes a very long time to change. In the sequence, he points that there's what he calls positive political economy, okay, which is related to institutional environment, formal rules of game, polity, judiciary, bureaucracy, institutional environment, as he calls it. It takes less time to move, to change. Then he goes to the level of transaction costs, which is related to governance, play the game, et cetera, et tal. And finally, the more immediate level, which is the level of the market, okay, and he calls neoclassical economy, which deals with resource allocation, employment, incentive. So in Williamson's vision, these theories are already connected, because each one of them has his role to explain some specific problem, and each one, and so they are complementary. Other authors, as Professor Hodgson, presents a list of features that those authors have in common. And the first is usually emphasis on institutional and cultural factors. Second, analysis open interdisciplinary. Second, no recourse to model to rational utility maximization agency, or at least less recourse. Fourth, mathematical and statistical techniques are recognized as servants of economic theory and not the object of economic theory. Five, analysis starts from stylized facts of theoretical conjectures concerning causal mechanisms. And finally, extensive use is made of historical and comparative empirical material. So we can see that there's much more similarity among those authors than Paul and DiMaggio would make us believe. The third author that I choose to highlight this notion of similarity is Richter. In this article, he was comparing new institutional economic, especially Williamson new institutional economic, with new economic sociology. And he says, first, that both deal with social structures or organization, which is another similarity also. And what I think is most important is that he thinks that where most of them still differ are their models of men, because each one of them uses a specific model of man. including rational choice. Some use rational choice on one side, and individual rationality, pure or bounded, on the other. So I went to Elinor Ostrom because she has, in this article 2007, a proposal that says that the analytical work or the theorizing on institutions requires the development of two sets of elements. By the one side, what she called the action arena, which establishes the rules that the participants will have to follow, or that is expected that participants to follow. The position, the action, what they can do, who controls who, etc., etc. And on the other hand, we have to establish the individual participants. Who are those agents? Okay, their preference, their information, their choice mechanism, and I am going to concentrate on this part of the requirements for theorizing in institutions. Again, I should have chosen wrong, okay? And I'd love to have contributions from you. But anyway, we can define some attributes of the individuals, okay? And someday, to each of them will have some kind of opposition, okay? So for instance, some authors attribute much more importance to coordination than to conflict. Some attribute more importance to conflict than and so forth. Some uses both, depending on the situation they are treating. Some authors attribute intentionality, others give more importance to rule follower or behavioral habits. Concerning the motivation of the agency, I could identify three main motives, okay? Self-interest, culture, routine, and commitment, or values, moral, ethical values. Some authors give more importance to perfect information or asymmetric information, others to uncertainty. And finally, some use unbounded and others use bounded. Based on these features, I try to compare some authors who deal with the question of institutions and specifically with the question of institutional change. And what did I do? I did 3 boxes, okay, where I tried to compare the authors in each box in 2 dimensions. This first box, on the vertical line, actually we have conflict versus coordination, and the horizontal self-interest versus other. I did commitment and then rule follower or habit in those other. Okay. Why do I place Buchanan here? Because I think that Buchanan is the neoclassical author who really gives us an explanation about the emergency of rules, even though he has nothing to do, and he says explicitly that he's not an institutionalist, but he explains rules in his way. Why in his way? Because he has to be placed right in the corner here of this box. He is always thinking about coordination and self-interest. The other authors who, in a way or another, are more identified with institutions, actually, they are much more together, okay? Even though there are some difference among their positions. For instance, Williamson is much more close to the self-interest assumption than Saying, who proposes commitment together with self-interest or north. Okay. Hodgson and Ostrom I place more or less in the same level because Ostrom in the last more recent work have been working with evolutionary theory more and more. And Nelson Winter, of course, right on the other side, because it's almost almost only habits. Okay. If we do the same thing with the horizontal x, the same variables, and here, some people, I guess, are not seeing because of the sign. Here we have uncertainty versus perfect information. Again, we have more or less the same picture, okay? We have Buchanan, totally isolated from all the others, while the others are, in a way or another, much more closer from one another. And finally, just to emphasize the argument, I maintained uncertainty and perfect information in here, and I place intentionality and rule follower or habits in the horizontal axis. And here we saw that there is a little more dispersion than before, especially because of SEM, okay? But also because north goes much more to the left, and I dare to place Professor Hodgson also much more to the left, which I don't know if he will agree with me, but I have some quotes from him that I try to use as arguments of my argument, as proof of my arguments. Okay? So, besides the common characteristics that was pointed and was shown here by Hodgson and Richter, we can also point other three characteristics. First, uncertainty. Second, conflict that appears in a way or another in all the writers. And methodological individualism, which actually Powell and DiMaggio have pointed as a characteristic of the institutionalist. And this, I think, is the good news for our words, is that some of them are going towards building a unified theory. And then I presented you some examples of what I call going toward a conjoint unified theory. Professor Hodgson, again, in this 2006 article, he said that rules are not in DNA, okay? But it will be a mistake to go to the other extreme and regard rules following as something entirely deliberative. I interpreted this phrase as saying, sometimes people are deliberative. They are not entirely, but they are in some circumstances, okay? So I'm asking here, as the author is right in front of me, if my interpretation is correct, okay? And he goes further, saying that, however, as Coleman-Hinton and Veblen argue in more depth, behavioral habit and institutional structure are mutually imprinted and mutually reinforced. Both aspects are relevant to the full picture. Okay? This view is shared by Elinor Ostrom also. Okay? In this article of 2000, she had already proposed what she called the indirect evolutionary approach. And what this indirect evolutionary approach has as features. First, rigorous theoretical approach based on game theory mainly. According to her, it helps understanding how preference, including those associated to social norms, evolve and adapt. And so we can feel the flavor of evolutionary theory easily. Learning is by adapting, mainly, in this proposal. Through experience, agents learn fair trust, and fairness. A proposal like this, coming from Elinor Ostrom, who became known by the problem of the cones, and who defends, supports, like Williamson, the superiority of private ordering in certain circumstances, okay? This is, for me, is a display that she's trying really to combine intentionality with habits and adoption by adapting and learning through time with one another. K to human evolutionary changes is the intentionality of the place. This is his usual position, right? But then he said the selection mechanisms in Darwinian evolutionary theory are not informed by beliefs. Okay? And further, he said that part of scaffolding humans erects is an evolutionary consequence of successful mutations, and is therefore part of genetic architecture of humans, such innate cooperation within small interacting groups. Part is a consequence of cultural evolution, such as development of institutions. So in this quote, he attributes practically the same importance, okay, to the mutations, the adaptation, the evolutionary process, and the cultural evolution that develop all institutions to favor large group. Where you can see even better the influence of evolutionary economy in the work of Douglas North, in the fact that learning for him is mainly absorbed by adjusting to subtle events, okay? And so I think that probably this search for the cognitive theory has informed him much better and made him be able to go so farther away, in a sense, of the other writings that he had before. And these are the ideas. I left the bibliography, and I thank you very much.
Hello, good morning. So when I received this task of talking about varieties of institutionalism, wasn't sure what to do. So then my original idea was to set up, talk about these three different types. But then when I figured out that I'd have people know more about the difference between the first and the other two, I'm going to focus on the transition from this to this. What I'm going to try to do is convince you, and something that will probably get some of you a bit angry, is that the new institutional economics has already transitioned into the other, into the last. It's become mainstream. It's either been absorbed or it's conquered, depending how you like to see this. So whenever new institutional economics, when you think of new institutional economics, I say, whenever you see anything, the new something economics, I get really suspicious of that. So, and everybody loves doing that because it means your work's different, right? So let me give you some examples. I did this some years ago. I went to Google and I put new economics, or the new economics of, and then try it one day, you'll see. You'll see new. So this guy says, well, I work on the economics of media, but it's a new economics of media, you see. This guy here, these people, doesn't have the name, but the new economics of organization. Here, David Card and Alan Kruger, the new economics of the minimum wage. The needed new economics of abundance. Clusters and new economics of competition. See, go home today and get whatever you do and put the word new in front of wherever there's economics. It makes you sound very important. The new industrial organization and new comparative economics. There's a whole bunch of examples of these. New growth theory. And then you have these guys. And they come up and they say, well, or us guys, whatever. the new institutional economics. And remember in the beginning, there was a big fight to see if it was going to be new institution or neo-institutional, and wasn't clear. So there's 2 points here when you see this. First is this idea of calling it a society. That's, what I'm going to try to do in the rest of the talk is argue that these guys actually, because what can happen when you have your theory and then or your society, and then you say this is the new thing, this is the way of the future. One thing you risk happening is that people 10 years later will say, they'll look and you see what's happened. Either you haven't had any impact whatsoever and it can't be new anymore, or you've disappeared, or you've had success, and if you've had success, it also isn't new anymore, but you'll still be around and you'll have other people using your ideas. Or maybe you killed everybody else and there's only you left. So let's sort of see what happened here. So the problem with society is that whenever it's society, you think, well, we're going to exclude other people and we're going to keep, we're going to be impermeable. We won't let other people in. And so first I want to argue, I'll just give 2 brief examples, 2 pieces of evidence that this isn't the case. And more, this is even better evidence, because here I'm going to give, this is a book by Stiglitz, and in the introduction, in the foreword, he says, he's trying to classify, why did I write this book, where does it fit, what's it supposed to do, and he says, this book can be viewed as a contribution to the new institutional economics. This is a very good sign, I would say, because when you have one of these, the new economics of something, most other people, they don't want to associate themselves with you, right? Unless if what you're doing has a very broader appeal. And here you have a Nobel Prize winner saying, look, I want to be associated with these kinds of people. So well, I don't know if these days other people want to be associated with him, but and here, Avnish Dixit, the same kind of thing. And lawlessness in economics, and people who are there in Iceland will remember the talk. He talked about this book. And he says more or less the same thing. Where does this book fit in? And in the end, he says, lawlessness in economics can be regarded as a subfield within the broad conceptual framework of the new institutional economics. So I think that's a very good thing. You have these 2 very, 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 very big names, and they don't have to go looking for little houses in which to fit in, and they actually associate themselves in this sense. So what I want to do now to convince you then of this transition of what's happened to new institutional economics, and it's going to be mainly in this context, right? This is, to me, probably the biggest question of economics of all time, the nature and causes of the wealth, poverty, inquiry to the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. The Great Divergence. Until 1800, everybody was poor, and then suddenly some people started not being poor anymore, and the others were poor. And this goes against all economic, not all, it goes against economic theory. Interest rates shouldn't allow this to happen. See, some are growing, others are not, and they're not catching up. There's not a convergence. And there's been always in economics a huge interest in explaining this. And in the past 15 years, this has revived again. It's been a big question. So, so when you start here, I want to start. And start around 1991. Economists, how did they try to explain this? Just the regular mainstream economists. They have their solo models, and you look at all these economic variables, and there's technology, and then there's human capital and endogenous human capital. But they're always able to explain some of this, but it's not quite good enough. And then you have these Barrow equations, where you get cross-country regressions, and you try to explain why there isn't this catch-up, or what they're trying to explain is that there actually is a catching up. It's really hard to do, and it's slow, and you can't really see it that well in the data, but it's there. This is what he's basically saying. The data aren't really explaining what our theory says happens, this convergence, that the poor will catch up with the rich. And then what they started doing is, at some point, sticking in institutions as a variable. And once you do that, once you have some measure of institutions, then you explain much more. And this, in the past 20 years, has become a fad, and I'm going to try to convince you of this. Everybody's been trying to do this. It's really great fun to do. you choose some form of institutions. I'm going to show you about 10 or 15 different types, some measure of institutions, some aspect or dimension of institutions. And part of this literature was precisely because you can't measure institutions, your value added or your big thing of your paper is how are you going to capture, what proxy are you going to use, what technique are you going to use to measure this type of institution. And you put it into a regression to explain GDP per capita or something like that. And it's really fun because it always works. You know, it's always significant, always in the right direction, and it's great to present at conferences. So here's one. In addition to all the economic variables, let's put in corruption, bureaucratic efficiency, political instability, and it adds explanatory power. Here, and then look at how these things become more amorphous, more hard to measure, more weird in a sense. So then economic freedom. I'm not going to look at these. This is just to show that people have been doing this. Then religion. This is Bowery puts religion. It's interesting that believing, going to church is bad for growth, see negative, but believing in heaven and hell is good for growth. Which means you should stop going to church and we'll grow. And here, democracy, and here there's fights. This one's not clear which way it goes and everything. Democracy, social trust, very amorphous. How do you measure, how do you define it? But people do. Lots of people have been studying this and they find negative effects, positive effects, zero effects. Social capital, a bit different, but big literature on this. Ethnic diversity, legal origin, foreign aid, governance. This is another one, governance. What exactly does that mean? But you measure it somehow, you put it in the regression, and it works. So this has been a huge literature. It's added value. It's become interesting. There's always something, it's sort of a black box. You would like to know more, right? And there's also big problems of endogeneity and other technical problems like this. That they start, I want to see now a trend how these things have evolved. This day, doing a cross-country regression and just sticking in another variable that measures some other aspect of institution is fun, but you know, you're adding very little because so much has been done. So I want to argue that this paper here has been very important, the sets of paper. Engerman and Sokoloff, they've come to answer this question. They said, let's look at a colony, South America, North America, and that's the idea. Let's see if we can explain why countries grow and don't grow today by looking what happened at the colonization period. And then so the idea is, what explains why America grew, why Canada grew, why Brazil didn't grow, why South America didn't grow. And you had all these other theories from centuries ago and others saying, well, maybe it's the culture, it's the British. If you're colonized by British, you grow, or maybe it's geography. If the place had natural resources, it'll affect you one way or the other. And they had this idea of factor endowments. Wherever the colonist comes, he arrives, and no matter if he's British, doesn't matter where he comes, it doesn't matter what culture he's from, he says, how can I make money here? How can I make money with this colony? And if it's possible to plant sugar, if it's good to use slaves, that's what you'll do, if you're British or if you aren't British, whatever. And and then you do that. And if you do start with sugar and slaves, you have concentration from the beginning, you have concentration economic, political, and that persists till today. This is a big part of this area, persists. There's this huge persistence. People used to be path dependents, now they like the word persistence. There's this huge persistence because whoever's in power will use their power to keep concentrating, and that will go on until present day. If you're in the US, you come and you say, how can I make money out of this? Can I put slaves here? Can I plant sugar? No, you can't. Just cattle and grains. Grains don't know economies of scale. So what am I going to do? I'm going to start with grains, and because of that, it's going to start egalitarian, economically, politically, and that's going to persist until today. So then you have a reversion reversal of fortune, what they say. Brazil and South America, these were the good colonies. These people won the colonial lottery. You would think it's the opposite. Oh no, the good thing was to be the English won because they got the USA. No, they didn't know that. They lost. They got the USA. There's nothing here. This is a terrible colony. I wanted to have Brazil. I wanted to have all these islands in the Caribbean. But then what happens is because of the concentration, the exclusion, you don't grow. And the other countries grow because of the openness that feeds in and generates growth. So that's their perspective. This didn't have much impact. These were climatricians doing this. But then, I'll skip this. Then these guys here, and this is where it changes. These guys here do basically the same story. What they have is the Engerman-Sokolov story. And this paper had a huge impact. At one point, this was the most cited paper in economics. I read that somewhere. So this had a really big, and it had a big impact mostly because of the way they did, they took care of the endogeneity problem. There's a problem that institutions cause growth, but growth causes institutions. It's always difficult to deal with. And they had this idea of going back 500 years and using mosquitoes as an instrumental variable. And this got such, for some reason, got such wide circulation that basically this idea, they had a measure of institutions today, a measure of GDP today. So you see, whoever has better institutions here are restraints against the government. It today, expropriating today, and Brazil somewhere around here. And then the way they dealt with endogeneity was ingenious. And it sort of fed into this new thing where, well, I'll get there. So what I argue today, this is the new orthodoxy. In this growth area for sure, but I'm saying this is even more general. Then you have other hypotheses to explain the Great Divergence, which are here. So let's look at these. One impact that it has, it made history sexy. You have people doing economic history today who 10 years ago would never touch it with a stick. It's become sexy after Asamoah, there's so many people, and I'm going to show you some examples. Journals publishing papers on themes related to economic history who wouldn't do this. And another thing that this paper has done, and not only a paper, but the whole profession has gone that way, is that a big focus on empirical issues. You go to conferences these days, maybe it's a selection bias of the conferences I go to, but you have I remember in the 90s, you'd go to conferences, everybody had a model and they spend 30 minutes, 29 minutes explaining the model, and then they'll say something about it, the empirical part. Empirical part doesn't matter. That's not good. These days, it's the opposite. Nobody makes a new model. There's no new model. And you say, I have a new model, and then everybody, no, but such and such a guy has a model better than that. The models are mostly already there. All you can do is tinker. So the big emphasis is on the empirical part, and it's incredibly rigorous. If you have an instrument, it's basically impossible for you to convince the audience that your instrument is correct, that the exclusion restriction will work, that the instruments are not weak. It's really, really hard, and that's where the focus is. So you don't believe me, of course. You're saying, now this guy's crazy. This isn't happening. 5 minutes. You're saying, well, he doesn't know my colleagues. My colleagues don't have the least idea that these things are happening. I'm going to convince you that even if that's so, my colleagues don't. So why am I saying here that this has had a huge impact? I would argue that it's your colleagues and my colleagues that are probably late, right? They're being left behind by their own type. So here is an idea. I tried to get some papers. These are all papers in the Engerman-Sokolov tradition, in the Asamoah Johnson-Robinson tradition. And look at this. And you've probably seen some of these papers. Where are they being published? They're being published in the QJE. They're being published in Review of Economic and Statistics. They're being published in Econometrica, a paper about slaves in Peru being published in the Econometrica. That would never happen. Of course, there is something, there's a little bit of a new technique in the econometrics she uses, but still. And so on and so forth, and there's all the American Economic Review and this kind of thing. So that's one thing. Of course, whenever you're successful like this, there's people who will try to disagree with you. So then I put a whole bunch of people exactly going against this approach, but that just proves my point. If you're not having an impact, nobody bothers criticizing you. So the fact that you raise criticism means that you are creating this. And then so I had just two more pieces of evidence. One is this. Well, Asamoah and Robinson, they do have a book, Democracy and Dictatorships, but they have a book coming out this year called Why Nations Fail. That is, it's not even out yet, and people already know, they're already doing presentations, it already has a cover. And this is going to have a very big impact. It's sort of joining up all the research they had, and I think this has big impact on students and more people doing this type of research. And the whole thing, we're saying, well, but who says this has anything to do with institutions? This is their central model. I mean, in the book. Acemoglu is probably one of the biggest modelers there is today, but this book it's a 700-page book, and it's based basically on this thing. It's based on, I don't have time to explain it, but economic institutions and political institutions. When do you get change? You get change when, if you have inclusive economic and political institutions, you don't get change. If you have exclusive, you don't get that much change, but then shocks happen, and sometimes you go to the corners, and then you have change happen. So that's one piece of evidence. I don't know if you buy it, but I'm saying these guys are in high evidence, and they're using institutions. They're using this language. They're studying what new institutional economics has always said is the central thing to this. So you have two of the most influential guys in economics studying as their central tool, as their central object, what we have been saying for decades was the central thing to study. And finally, the last example, I don't know if you've seen this, Paul Romer. Paul Romer, I remember all the macroeconomic colleagues, and they talk Paul Romer. So this is one of these macro guys, and what's Paul Romer doing today? He has this idea of doing charter cities. He's not an academic anymore. And he says, well, he has this institute, says, how do we get growth? How can we get growth in practice? You can't go to any country and sort of change the institutions because it's too hard to change. It's too hard to, you already have elites, you already have all these rules. So let's go somewhere, buy land. This sounds absolutely crazy if you're hearing it for the first time, and it's Paul Romer. And this is being taken seriously by policymakers and country governments who are already jumping into this. Let's buy land, and then we'll start a city from scratch. We'll build from zero. And if we build from zero, we can put in the rules we want. He doesn't say the word institutions. He calls them rules. He wants to, I don't know why. But what he's talking about is institutions. We'll put in the institutions we want, and then we can get growth. So what is he saying? This guy, one of the biggest macroeconomists of all time, and he's saying, the only way to really get growth, to solve development problems, is focusing on what? On institutions. So that's the kind of evidence I'm presenting to you. Because it could be the opposite. Maybe if we would be, new institutional economics would have said institutions are important, but economists would keep on not caring, and they'd say, no, let's go here, it's something else. And they could be saying today, it's something else. The something else is the really important thing. Let's really study the something else. They're not. They're saying institutions is central to it. So that's basically my point, and I focused on this transition here. Maybe that new institutional economics has been absorbed or has had its impact, and that's a good thing.
Okay, I have the impossible task to discuss these three presentations that I have been aware just now. So maybe I will comment another issue. But anyway, what I would like to do, I was thinking about what am I doing. Then we are facing three very different presentations. And in fact, what we are discussing is theory of knowledge, theory of science, how science progresses, how do we improve our models, how do we build our models, how do we apply our models, how do we eliminate our errors, if it's possible, and if they are really mistakes. And so it's a very difficult task, and I will not do this. So sometimes I ask, and I will be really a discussant to put some questions, and maybe we can discuss everybody together afterwards. Do we need unification? I don't think so. I think it's very good to have different views, different dimensions, different, let's say, the impact of different cultures. And I think we can go ahead, listen to the different people, how do they look at the same issue you are analyzing. Are we facing complementary approaches or rival approaches? So if we are in front of rival approaches, we are doing something about competition in theories, we should control for our question. Are we raising the same questions, the same issues? Are the same issues being followed? Which are the consequences of having different approaches? Because in the end of the day, I think all of us economists and many sociologists or the sociologists want to design perfect public policy to improve the world. We are very omnipotent. Is there this word in English, omnipotent? Yeah. So these, I think, are the questions we are raising today in different ways, but we are touching this kind of issues. So for me, sometimes, or listen to these three authors and economists and sociologists, I would say we are talking about different questions. We are putting different questions. When yesterday we are discussing multiple solutions to governance, what is puzzle for one is not the puzzle for the other. And maybe the puzzle is the theory and not the puzzle is not the reality. And maybe the reality has to fit to our model in some way. And we don't have, listened to everybody yesterday and today, I think we do not have a common concept of institution. So maybe we have to start our speaking, our speeches, our presentations, saying, my understanding about what is institution is this one or that one. And sometimes you are discussing institutional change, so in a very aggregate discussion. And sometimes we are talking about organization theory and how franchising as governance appears, or how can I understand franchising as a part of a firm or organization. And so I think sometimes we are asking how social norms are built, how they appear. Sometimes we are asking how social norms influences the economic decisions. So how to explain a variety of results in this complex reality? How do we can explain innovation and different profits, different performances of different firms in the same sector with the same product with the same consumers? So these, I think, are the issues we are trying to touch in a panel like that. And really, I am very skeptical, and in fact, I'm not if I dream of a kind of convergence. This is kind of boring. But I would like to mention something that I read again for the 10th time about that it was written by Ronald Coase. In a seminar about policy issues and research opportunities in industrial organization. Industrial organization, because for whom doesn't know, I teach an industrial organization. And so I am a little bit attracted by the field. And so the name of the discussion was Policy Issues and Research Opportunities in Industrial Organization, organized and sponsored by NBER, to celebrate its 50 years in 1972. And so Ronald Coase presented a paper there, or not a paper. In fact, he was a keynote speaker. And he started saying that it would be very good that NBR started to. We don't have a theory on the forces which determine the organization of industry, what activities firms undertake, and how the activities are organized for each type of firm. And he says, after studying what happens within firms, studies should also be made on the contractual arrangement between firms. I think we progressed a lot from that, but so far, if you take, let's say, the last book of Stephen Martin about industrial organization, you see there the presentation of the structure of markets and the theories or how you relate the concentration of markets with subjectivity of costs. And then you find out that you don't have equal efficient firms in the structure of the markets. So you have a logic distributions showing big concentration among the largest companies, but in all markets, in all industries, you have a number of smaller firms with different sizes. And then you go to Gibra's law and include some random effect, dynamic effect that you cannot accomplish by this kind of equilibrium of industry in the long run. So what I'm trying to tell you is that even in the industrial organization debate, we have this institutional very clearly within the industrial organization book. So in a certain way, I see the same thing as you presented here in my specific field, that institutions are there. You discuss vertical integration, vertical restrictions, not only related to market power, but to efficiency of organizations. And I would finish my discuss just saying that when I and Paulo were in CAGE, was amazing how many times we included this kind of debate within our decisions, not only to take the decision, but to think about the remedy and how the companies would react in the institutional environment that we have in Brazil and not in Switzerland, not in Europe or US, how they will respond. Is it true that the fine imposed to a cartel will have the deterrence effect? Is the same remedy in Brazil will work in the same way as Europe? If we change our law to converge to other laws, the result will be the same. We had a discussion, and we included, all the 7, and in fact, we had the different compositions of the commission, more than 10 people. In a way or other way, the institutions were there. And so in this sense, I think that it's part of our models, it's part of our reason. And in this sense, I think Coase must be happy because he once asked if new institutional economics had to have a journal. He answered, no, you have to publish in the regular journals, and when you are published, we will be there, and we will win the battle, the war, because we are there in the heart of the theory, and in the sense, I think, we are there. Okay, these are my creative way to discuss. Okay, we have, you audience have the floor, Hogs on the first, and then Carlos, please.
I've lots to say, but I'll try and be brief. First of all, I'll comment on the paper that commented on me, kindly mentioning me. I was put on the table halfway between believing in intentionality and rule following. Okay, and the evidence for that was to quote me on deliberation. You know, I think rule following, deliberation, and intentionality are different things. All intentional behavior, from my view, is rule following, all of it. Okay, so all intentional behavior is rule following. I mean, you can define intentional behavior more broadly than deliberation if you wish, but that's another issue. So I don't put myself on the middle, I put myself on the right-hand side. And incidentally, it might be useful to add Hayek to that typology as well, which is an interesting paper. Okay, my second remark is to connect the first paper with the last paper. The last paper was a nice satire on the use of the word new, okay? And I use that as a cue to refer to the first paper because I'd like to make the word old more fashionable, okay? In my presentation this afternoon, I'm going to talk about the nature of disciplines. It's ironic that it's sociologists rather than economists that read Weber, okay? Yet Weber was in the Department of Economics, okay? It's also ironic that nobody reads Veblen, yet Veblen is described as a sociologist. Sociologists don't read him, and he was in the Department of Economics, okay? Now my claim, I won't elaborate, my claim is that actually all this stuff about agency and culture and freedom to act and intentionality and all those dilemmas were essentially solved by Veblen, okay? The trouble is that sociologists don't read him, so my recommendation is read Veblen. He solves the problem of agency, briefly because biology is partly in the picture, as part of the reasoning. And biological variation makes us different, so straight away we cannot be cultural puppets, okay? Culture can do an enormous amount, but our capacity to act in a culture depends on our biology, and our biology varies, okay? There's a sort of philosophical problem of what agency is, and some sociologists think you get the solution by detaching the agent from any notion of causality. The agent is uncaused. It's philosophical nonsense. It's a brief sort of rejection of that view without treating it seriously. Veblen didn't do that. I mean, that's kind of philosophical hand-waving. He said intentionality is caused, but there's a diversity of causes, and that can reinstate a notion of agency. The trouble is with sociologists, I mean, I don't know about your view, but they don't like biology and they don't like the word evolution, okay? But I mean, let's get real about it. We are biological beings as well as social beings. Both have to be taken into account. So the old institutional economics.
So assuming that Bernardo is right, that we are the mainstream now, right, Bernardo? And assuming that the academic market behaves as any other market, right? So in other words, and the market of ideas, and who rules the market of ideas concentrates resource and concentrates power, right? We should expect not only that non-institutional economists and refers to institutions, right? But we should as that school and rule, right? We should rule, and because institutions are going to be endogenous in that perspective, that as soon as we get that power, we enforce that power with resources that we accumulate and power that we hold. So we should expect that, and we should have more publication, we should have more money, we should get more Nobel Prizes, we should be ruling in that particular market. So in that perspective, we may not be at the mainstream yet. We might be on the doorstep, in order to use an idea of an economic growth. So we might be there. And a good reference of being a mainstream might be and that when we see a lot of us publishing in Econometrica and lots of us publishing in all those journals, not only Stiglitz and others that don't define themselves as new institutionalists, referring to new institutions, don't you think?
Well, I have a comment. First, it was great, great. Thank you for the panelists, and particularly Charles for organizing the session. Well, I will start with the question that Beth poses. Do we need unification? And I will give you a short answer. No, but I will rephrase your questions. Do we need explicit separation? And I would answer also no. And the reason is it's so difficult, particularly in this field, to define and the frontiers of the different approaches. For example, sociological economics and economic sociology and new institution economics, old or original institution economics. So the frontiers are fading out, and we are moving from one field to the other, and I think this is nice. And this idea of having explicit separation actually is a construct. It's the problem of our cognition, but it's not happening actually in the research. And within the new institution economics, we have a lot of things. It's very difficult to define new institution economics. So, and then I moved to the Bernardo comment that we won or we are about to win the battle. Actually, I do think that what defines scientific paradigm is not exactly the subject if we are talking about institutions, but the way we solve problems. And the way we solve problems, I think it's still very different from the mainstream. For example, they are talking about institutions, so the subject is this, but the way they research, the way they try to reach the new knowledge is, in my opinion, still very different. For example, when you presented your paper about the priests in the Amazon region, actually, your paper was not about the priests in the Amazon region. It was about the property rights and the fact of property rights in agricultural production and environment and things like this. But all the discussion was about the priests in the Amazon forest, which were the instrumental variable. So the discussion about the mosquito is very, very important as an instrumental variable. And sometimes as we have the pressure to publish in the mainstream journals, and I noticed this yesterday in institutional economics, more driven by the question, more flexible regarding the methodology, and in the mainstream economics is mainly or absolutely driven by the formal techniques. Okay.
Do we need consensus? No. But we need some definitions. And I keep asking the definition of institutional economics because it says a lot on institutions, but say nothing about economics in this sense, how we look at economics with this institutional framework. So I keep asking the definition, a good definition for institutional economics. Second, in the first paper, this question, where do preferences come from, is a very important question because it will define different approaches. So I think that this has to be an answer. Where do preferences come from? This is a very important question. And the third comment is on Basilia. It was great. I enjoyed a lot your paper as well. All the three, they were great. And the third one is just a remark. If you keep this, if you locate all these authors in the way they are in your presentation, we see three more coherent ways because they have the same place in all the squares. Williamson, Buchanan, and Nelson Winter. So maybe we have to think about this because they are very coherent. Yeah, they occupy the same position in whatever the variables are, they occupy the same position. So they seem to be more coherent. Is it true?
So Jeff asked me whether I like biology. I like biology. And I think I also like what John Paget is doing at Santa Fe Institute. I think he's doing great things in evolutionary modeling of Florence elites. So it's a great work in the side of sociology today. So I think, John Paget. John Paget, yeah. So, but it's not mainstream sociology though, I agree with you. Then, to the core question here between Beth and Paulo, whether there should be unification. I'm not sure in the discipline side we would have same undergrad courses like sociology and economics together. I do think that there's lots of value keeping separate courses for several reasons. But when you ask these, and Paulo also asked that, I think to myself, how the models in the articles approach this very same question. And I think of the models that I see of my colleagues in my school as presenting very lean models and usually about choices. And when I see the models in sociology papers, they tend to be a little bit more about structural modeling, how the whole thing is changing at the same time. So for instance, I did a model on social networks, on how networks and ties change over time. And I presented to someone sociology and I said, people tend to prefer ties with this kind of people and not with other kinds of people. And the person said, well, you cannot say that people want to establish these ties or the other ties. You can just say that the whole thing is going towards that direction because you cannot see preference here. So in a certain way, I think they tend to model different levels, unit levels. And the complementary here is really about how to integrate these levels. I think this is the greatest opportunity here.
First comment is about the provocation of Betty on if we need unification. And of course, as you should guess, my answer is yes. And my answer is yes because evidence from field and from laboratory experiments have been showing that individuals are not the same, that people vary on their answers in same circumstances, including depending on the answer of the others, okay? The studies of Elinor Ostrom, especially on irrigation systems, show it clearly that usually the designs that are made by the farmers are better than the ones made by very well-trained engineers. Why? Because they know the environment, they know each other, they know how to deal with each other. And why they do know this? They were not teaching this in the school. They learn through experience and living together, okay? So I insist that to understand institutional change, either in the large macro environment or in the specific context of a village, for instance, it is important that we have a model that could deal with all this diversity on behavior, okay? Thanks, Professor Hodgson. I'm gonna change your position in my box, okay? And I agree totally with Anna, of course, that the great question is where do preferences come from. I guess that Douglas North tried a little to grasp this problem. And I'm sure that all the authors that I quoted and many others are all trying to answer this question, or saying in other words, it's really a big question. And interesting what you observe concerning Nelson and William. So I guess this shows us the resilience of these authors to try to cooperate with one another.
Let me, just to make clear exactly what I'm claiming and what I'm not claiming. It's as if there's this a dinner and then there's this big table where all the adults sit. That's the mainstream people. And we're sitting at this little kiddie table. And all I'm saying isn't that we came over and we kicked the people out of the big table and we're sitting at the table. That's not it at all. It's that we were talking about something, and now they're talking about it. And they might actually, if you ask most of them, if you ask a student that's doing some kind of work in institutions, he'll think that this has come from the big table. He won't. They'll cite North here and there. And maybe our table's been pulled a little closer, and sometimes we get to sit in the big table for a little while. But that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that we've taken over. And that's just the way it works.
Okay, so I think we have a very rich discussion, and we are on time. So give a hand for the speakers and for our